In June of 2012, I finished shooting the first season of The Temporal Reverie. At the end of that episode, I invited viewers to watch for the next season of the show that fall, but the second season didn't debut until July of 2015, 3 years after season 1. During that interim, I entered a period of my life that was quite turbulent, fraught with serious challenges to my health, my income, and my ability to keep a home together for myself and my dogs. I was quite close to death at one point. In the fall of 2014, my life took a genuinely frightening turn through the Valley of Shadow. As things got progressively more difficult, I felt like someone who'd been singled out without cause for a karmic beating. What could God's love mean for me if everything in my life was collapsing? In the fullness of time, the memory of seemingly senseless hardship and suffering achieved clarity. I came to see that I'd passed through a time of trial that would test whether or not I truly believed the things I've shared in prior episodes. When the only means at my disposal to escape disaster was a belief in how to change the conditions of my reality, it was time to commit to that faith. On this edition of The Temporal Reverie, I want to share a very personal story with you. That you can watch this video gives away a little bit of the ending, so it's not much of a spoiler to say the turnaround my life needed so urgently, the one that was in my hands alone to set in motion, did arrive. Along the way, I learned important lessons I want to share with you. The storm clouds began gathering even as I started working on the first season of The Temporal Reverie. An ill-considered relationship began buckling under multiple intensifying stresses. Naturally, the more my thoughts became fixated on my worst fears, the more rapidly those fears became the truth of things. Depression and occasional struggle in my life began surfacing more often and lingered for longer stretches. I had difficulty performing at a job that wasn't a great fit for me. The company and I parted ways, leaving me without health insurance, something that would prove quite dangerous. In August of 2012, with no advanced symptoms or warning, I began coughing up fluid from my lungs, repeatedly. My lungs were filling so fast I was unable to breathe in mere minutes. I lost consciousness inside the ER doors, unable to speak. I was on life support and sedated for a week while doctors pumped in intravenous antibiotics to halt pneumonia. I had gone into cardiac arrest after collapsing in the ER. Doctors gave me a 50% chance of survival, but I pulled through and went home to recover. Gradually regaining strength, I knew that although improving rapidly, the problems that had loomed before my trip to the hospital had not gone away. I was still unemployed, still in a precarious place of compromised health, and coming to the end of my lease. In that solitude, I made God a sincere promise. I promised that if there was a path God wanted me to take, then please make that path obvious and open the way to it, and I would do my utmost to travel it. God didn't wait long to take me up on my promise. Within a couple of weeks, I spoke on the phone with a friend who had moved to Seattle earlier that year. She hadn't yet heard about my hospitalization, and I called to fill her in. Then I shared my biggest anxiety, that the lease on my apartment would run out shortly with no way to pay the rent after unemployment ended, and no job. She generously offered to let me and my 2 dogs move in with her until I got strong enough to work. To me, this was God making a path obvious to me. Making good on my promise, I took my friend up on her kind offer. As my strength allowed, I began preparing to follow the path I was shown. I gave away a lot of things, clearing ties to a dead past. Besides, the more I gave away, the less I had to pack and move. Obstacles and challenges moved out of my way quickly. I had enough money to rent the truck and buy the gas needed to drive myself, my dogs, and my remaining belongings from Portland to Seattle. A few months after the move to Seattle, I had 2 comparatively minor and brief returning bouts of pneumonia. My health was still a good bit below par, but survival made it essential to get a job. By late summer, I had a short-term contracting gig. That December, I moved into an apartment I rented. It looked like I was getting back on my feet and starting over. It had taken all the money I had been able to earn to pay for the new apartment and get moved in. So when the oldest of my 2 dogs became seriously ill, I had no resources to pay for big vet bills. I took her to an emergency vet clinic where I learned she had a major internal infection. The infected organ could rupture, causing her a very painful death. But I couldn't pay for expensive emergency surgery in a clinic that required the entire amount up front. The only compassionate thing I could do was put her to sleep. The loss was overwhelming. As I was absorbing the costs of moving while saving to cover my own insurance costs, I could feel my health was deteriorating. Symptoms I'd seen before had returned. I started buckling under the strain, entering the worst struggle with depression I'd ever had. I knew what others meant about days you could barely get out of bed. By May of 2014, the contract job I'd been working came to an unexpectedly early end, adding the stress of being unemployed to everything else. My depression and health got worse. It was taking a lot longer to find a job than ever before. Life felt like a spiral of one crushing setback after another. I received unemployment, but even the maximum benefit wasn't enough to keep rent and expenses paid. I sold my laptop and other belongings in an effort to hold on to my home. I began thinking that if I had another attack of pneumonia, I would surrender and die. I was circling the drain. I don't remember exactly what triggered it, but as I thought about giving up on life, another thought began to nag at me. I was alone, except for my other dog, a rat terrier named Trixie. Trixie has separation anxiety, and although I rarely left the apartment, her anxiety got worse. I could tell she was afraid any time I left that I wouldn't come back, leaving her alone. I imagined what would happen to her if I let go of life. If I got seriously ill and died, her worst fears would be realized. I'd have abandoned her. I was the one person who had come into her life and not vanished. I thought about how long it might take for someone to find her, and how long she would suffer with hunger and thirst. No matter how terrible I felt, I knew I couldn't let that happen. Trixie was the one presence in my life that had never abandoned me, never rejected me, had always loved me and been a constant companion. If I couldn't find my own reason to live, I would find a reason in Trixie. But fortunes weren't improving. The rent fell behind. By October, I was being evicted. I put my things into storage and rented a motel room with a weekly rate that would accept me and Trixie. But time was running out. I had 6 weeks of unemployment left. After that, with no money for a room, we'd be on the streets. As weeks came and went, the one job prospect I had fell through. I began strategizing safe outdoor places to sleep. The social worker told me he could get me into a homeless shelter, but I'd have to part with my dog. I wasn't about to part with Trixie. Whatever came our way, we would face together. Just before Thanksgiving, I was down to one last week of unemployment. I contacted my case manager again to see if there were new housing options. I needed to either take that last check and pay for a final week in the motel, or check out early to have some money on the streets. He had nothing to offer me. I became very afraid of the future. The odds of getting back on my feet once on the streets were very slim. But no matter how daunting the circumstance, I found things for which I could be grateful. I needed life to take a favorable turn. But without a job, my cash dwindling with no further income and nowhere to go, the only option left was to manifest a turnaround. I had my faith, the courage of my convictions, and beliefs in spiritual disciplines I could employ to become the co-creator of a better reality for myself. If there was ever a time to put what I said I believed to the test, it was time. The difficulties that piled up were setting a stage for a test of faith, not a test of belief in God, in miracles, or in manifestation, but a test of whether I believed in my own birthright as a being of consciousness made in the image of God and empowered by that birthright. I returned into the familiar and comforting habit of taking long night walks. I had ample time for them, and Trixie loved them. On these walks, I considered my options. I talked freely to God. Very often, the words of the 23rd Psalm came to my mind on these walks. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, For thou art with me. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. I certainly felt as if walking in the valley of the shadow of death. My health was seriously compromised. I was in very real danger of facing a cold, rainy winter on the streets in Seattle. Death was a distinct prospect. In 2015, 45 homeless people died on the streets in Seattle, a number so shocking, Mayor Ed Murray declared a citywide state of emergency. I wondered more than once how I'd arrived at such a desperate state. But rather than get bogged down in feeling bullied by the universe, something I have done too often in my life, I grasped something in the psalm that I had not focused on before. The words of the poet King David claim the promise of God is not that we will never endure hardship, no challenge, feel hurt or betrayal or abandonment. God does not promise his children will never walk through the valley of the shadow of death. What God promises is something better. Though we may not see it at times, goodness and mercy will follow us. If we open ourselves to our divine source, to the quiet grace that makes sanctuary in the midst of any storm to come our way, goodness and mercy catches up to us in time. Uncertain of what to do, I repeated in prayers the promise I'd made to God in Portland when I left the hospital from pneumonia. If there was a path God wanted me to follow, then if he made the way obvious and opened the route, I would go. Then, what seemed like a lucky break or two actually heralded the start of a season of miracles arriving one after the next. Even though he'd previously told me he had no options to offer, I checked in with my social worker just before Thanksgiving. He was excited to hear from me, telling me he had been planning to call me that day. Because of my health complications, I qualified for an emergency 30-day housing voucher in another motel. Thankfully, that motel was just 2 blocks away from where I was already staying, making moving a manageable feat without a car. So Trixie and I had a warm, dry, safe place for December. After settling in, I spent time figuring out how to change the story of the future of my life. My resume was not providing a strong narrative for landing an interview, so I overhauled it, crafting its story to put me in a more favorable light for potential openings. I wanted to do everything I could, harnessing every tool and technique I knew for rewriting the conditions of my life, much as I had rewritten my resume. I needed counsel. I found the first deck of tarot cards I'd bought. For reasons I didn't understand at the time, I had put the deck in a backpack I kept with me, anticipating somehow that I'd need it. My question was simple. As I shuffled the cards, I thought about God, asking simply, "What would you have me do?" I used the magician as my significator because as a Pisces, often called the magicians of the zodiac, I relate deeply with that card. I dealt the Celtic cross spread, then got my tarot book to help me interpret the cards. The spread described my situation quite uncannily. Loss of finances, loss of security, loss of people who proved untrue. And the prognosis? The cards told me that if I held fast to the things I believe, remained true to my heart and my faith, and summoned as much patience as I could, eventually things would resolve well for me, putting me in better stead than I had been in years. Dr. Wayne Dyer told a story about one of his seminars when he held up an orange and asked what would come out if he squeezed the fruit. A youngster eagerly replied, "Orange juice comes out, of course." When he asked why orange juice should come out and not apple juice or grape juice, the kid answered that orange juice came out because orange juice was what's inside. Dyer said that if you want to know what's inside someone, watch what comes out when life squeezes them. What's truly inside is what comes out. I knew that when life squeezed me in the past, what came out was often no source of pride. Anger, frustration, complaint, cynicism, bitterness. All of that freely came out of my being when I got squeezed. None of that sounded like the attitude I needed. If I was going to approach God with the need to co-create a new reality for myself, I needed to change how I responded to the world. To engage God as a co-creator, I needed to see God as a collaborator. In successful collaboration, the key to success for me was always finding harmony with my collaborators, to be on the same page in terms of vision or approach. I needed to align myself in the closest possible harmony with my divine source. In the New Testament, Paul writes to various early Christian communities. In his letter to the Galatians, he advances a list of traits called the fruit of the Spirit that demonstrate harmony with God. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and temperance. Against such there is no law. Jesus often used the metaphor fruits borne as the key to identifying people who followed his teachings based on their actions, as in this scripture from Matthew. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? What Wayne Dyer emphasized in his story about fruit juice was the very lesson of Jesus. You recognize the kind of person someone is by the fruits of their actions. This was the key to understanding what I needed to change. When faced with frustration, I needed to reach inside for patience instead of irritation. I needed to summon and give my voice to gratitude instead of grumbling. I reminded myself of this need in the days that followed. When I felt a reflexive jerk toward negativity, I told myself to find a better mindset. I didn't always succeed, but I kept at it, moment by moment, day by day. What I saw is that while not everything went my way suddenly, the way I felt about my challenges made them easier to bear. Near the end of Karate Kid 3, Daniel has been maneuvered into a tournament match with a brutish adversary intent on destroying him. At first, Daniel reacts with fear, wanting to surrender to his opponent. But his sensei, Mr. Miyagi, tells Daniel that his best karate was still inside him and the time had come to let it out. So it was with me. My best self, my most hopeful being, the fruits of my best self had been buried out of fear. My best self was still inside me, and it was time to let it out. My teacher, my sensei, my spiritual master had spoken to me. It was time to step out in confidence. I began with disciplined meditation and prayer. I knew at the very least both provided space to shape my vision of myself and my world. I started each morning with Wayne Dyer's Ah meditation, naming my top 3 needs to manifest. I closed each day with the companion Om meditation. I did this each day without fail. Gradually, items for my meditations appeared. As one thing arrived, I replaced it in the meditation with another. I made sure to pray daily also, following the counsel of Christ who provided a prayer he urged as an example to follow, the Lord's Prayer. Rather than simply mouth the words from rote, I tried each time to say the words as if they were spoken spontaneously from the heart with as much personal emotion as I could feel in those words. But I also spoke to God on my nightly walks with Trixie. About that time, I learned about a special housing program that was part of an outpatient clinic for people with my health concern. It provided winter motel housing through the end of February. I signed up for the outpatient clinic and immediately inquired about the housing program. I was told that while welcome to apply, there was a waiting list to fill and only a couple slots expected to open. I was advised not to rely on this program to keep me from the streets. This was the sort of news that would previously send me spiraling into despair and fear, but I kept centered on gratitude, hope, and faith. I made an appointment to complete the paperwork and get onto the waiting list. When I arrived for my appointment, the administrator told me, "You're in luck." Someone in the program unexpectedly checked out that morning, creating an opening while I was en route to apply. My situation went instantly from "don't rely on this program to save you" to being saved by the program. I had housing in the very motel where I already lived. My residency extended to the end of February. A friend in Seattle, from when I lived there before, loaned me money to keep my cell phone on and the rent for my storage unit paid. A bit of unexpected freelance work came my way, providing me with some cash for things like dog food or laundry. The following January, I reconnected online with someone who'd been my manager years before. She now worked for a local big name in technology who was hiring. I'd applied for openings at this company before but gotten no response. My former manager offered to forward my resume to recruiting. By February, I'd been contacted by the recruiters and started a process that eventually became a new job. The hiring process moved quite slowly. At the end of February got nearer, and with it the end of my current housing, the process crept forward. It seemed increasingly likely with each step, from a phone screen to a check of my references and a review of my work samples to an eventual in-person interview, that I would get the job. The question became, would I get hired in enough time to earn a paycheck before I was on the streets in March? Right at the end of February, one of my contacts at a local support agency who knew I was close to getting back on my feet found a room that just opened at a transitional housing home where I could keep Trixie. I moved in early March. The new housing was beyond walking distance, so I boarded bus after bus that day, making multiple round trips to shuttle my things and eventually my dog. That day, I received the email I awaited. I was offered the job with a starting date in mid-March. While grateful for shelter, I was eager to get on my feet and out of transitional housing. The house manager didn't care for Trixie and went out of her way to make things difficult. I didn't feel entirely safe, but focused on the new job and figuring out how to get into permanent housing of my own. The job included a generous cash bonus, half of which was paid with my first paycheck. That first check then would provide all the funds to pay security deposit, pet deposit, first and last month's rent, moving costs to get my things out of storage, and repay my friend in full the money I'd borrowed. The string of unlikely breaks that broke my way then shifted into high gear. The things that manifested went from just meeting my needs to producing exactly what I envisioned. I wanted to rent a house. I knew the neighborhood where I wanted to live. I wanted a place with a fenced backyard for Trixie. Looking at rental housing on Craigslist one Sunday, I saw exactly what I wanted. A small house in the neighborhood I wanted with a fenced backyard that would accept a dog, and with a private owner-landlord rather than a property management company. I emailed the owner and made an appointment to see the house that day. I had no money for a security deposit until my first paycheck, but I didn't let that stop me. On the walk to see the house, I got a text message from the landlord. Someone else had just given him a check for the deposit. The house was taken. By this point, I was not about to surrender to defeat. I asked to see the house anyway, since I was on my way. The landlord said okay. I had an intuition that making an in-person connection would prove helpful. The house was perfect. I was friendly and upbeat, and let him know that if the situation changed, I was very interested. A mere few hours later, I received another text message from the landlord. The person who wanted the house had changed her mind and retrieved her deposit check. He told me that the house was mine if I wanted it. The only barrier was money for a security deposit to hold the house, but my friend here in Seattle generously loaned me the money. The transitional housing situation became tenuous. I was sure the house manager was looking for a way to use Trixie as an excuse to boot us out, so I went out on a limb. I asked the new landlord if he would accept a post-dated check for not just the balance of the move-in costs, but for extra days of prorated rent so I could vacate the transitional housing and move in before April 1st. He was uncertain at first, but after thinking about it and coming to my place of work to pick up the check, he gave me permission. Folks were stunned that a landlord would do such a thing. We left traditional housing for a home of our own. I got exactly what I desired in a place to live. Once my first paycheck arrived, the landlord was paid in full. My friend was repaid in full. The storage for my things was paid in full. The movers were paid in full. I was in the home I wanted, my beloved dog at my side all the while, and immediately back on my feet. In one fell swoop, I was no longer homeless. When I told my case manager all this, he marveled, saying he was astonished at how my needs seemed to fall into place just in time, even when previously there was no reason to expect it would. I told him what looked to him or others as one surprising bit of luck after another was the unfolding of deliberate, faithful intention. Any one of those breaks could simply be dismissed as luck. But the chain of things I needed to go my way, each of which went my way even when the safe bet was their impossibility, was clearly much more than good fortune. It was the constant expression of miracles I had called for in faith and with a spirit of gratitude. Next time on the Temporal Reverie, I want to speak about a transition that has been taking place in our world for a while now and which is still underway. One spiritual age is due to draw to a close while another age is on the way. What does it mean to say this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius? And if the age to come is Aquarius, what age are we now leaving? How do we know? The answers might surprise you. When everything I had normally relied upon had fled me, leaving me with no choice but to walk in the power of my faith, I was driven by circumstance to do the only thing I could. I might have never seen for myself the truth of things I believed if I'd had any other out. What seemed at first like crushing disaster was actually a forcing function. Sometimes, if you want to kiss the sky, you have to learn how to kneel. Sometimes, on your knees, you have a front row seat to witness God moving in mysterious ways. I'd like to know what you think of this episode. Please leave any questions or thoughts you want to share in the comments below. My thanks to God for this chance to share with all of you, and may the gifts of love, joy, peace, and enlightenment come to you all.